What do they want to just receive? I don't know what's going on, right? I'm not sure.
And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third and final debate between Representative James Jeffords and Michael Griffes. I would like to explain for you in detail the debate format for this morning's activities. The debate format was established by both candidates, and all of the details have been agreed to mutually. There will be 2 minutes of opening remarks by the moderator, which will then go directly to opening remarks by each candidate, lasting 2 minutes each. We will then entertain questions from the three panelists that are here. To my direct left, we have John Van Heusen from the Rutland Herald. In the middle, Alan Lagarde from WNNE. And to the far left, Chris Pearson from WSYB-WRUT. They will confine their questions to three basic areas. The first issue area will be foreign policy and defense. The second issue area will be health and aging and environment and agriculture. And the last area will be a free choice question. Because of the interest in the free choice question, that's where the questions will start today, with the free choice. And then each panelist will go into the other two remaining areas of their choice. The candidates will entertain any questions that involve the economic implications of these general issue areas, so those will all be appropriate questions. Okay, once the panelists have had an opportunity to ask their three questions each, which will be offered in rotation, the candidates' response time will be 1.5 minutes per question. Then there will be a period in the agenda where questions will be asked from candidate to candidate. There will be 2 one-minute questions for each candidate, and the response time will be 3 minutes each question. The closing remarks will be offered by the candidates, and the closing remarks will be 3.5 minutes each. According to the luck of the flip of a coin, Mr. Michael Griffes will open and provide the last closing remarks as well. The opening remarks will come from, the first opening remarks will come from Mr. Michael Griffes. He is of East Charleston. He's a businessman and a Naval Reserve pilot. A veteran of 12 years of active and reserve service, he is also an international representative for a major American corporation and helped his family start a successful sheet metal business in the Northeast Kingdom. Mr. Griffes.
Would you want to do both introductions?
You can do that. The other candidate is certainly a well-known individual in the state of Vermont. He is Congressman James M. Jeffords from Shrewsbury. He is a 7-year Republican congressman. Mr. Jeffords has also served Vermont as a state senator from Rutland County and as Attorney General. Congressman Jeffords is a national recognized leader in agriculture, job training, education, and pension legislation. I would ask you, before we begin, to please hold all of your applause to the end of the debate so that we can follow in a timely fashion. I know both of our candidates have other obligations to meet today, and the timeliness of our activities this morning will certainly impact on the success of the rest of the day. So let us begin with opening remarks from Mr. Griffes.
When Jim Jeffords is asked his political philosophy, he says, "I represent Vermont." Let's measure Jim against his own standard. Jim Jeffords voted against a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. Jim Jeffords opposed the Reagan tax cut. Jim Jeffords supported Democratic House Speaker Jim Wright's tax increase budget last year. In each instance, Bob Stafford voted differently. When I represent you, my record will be more like Bob Stafford's and less like Democrat Speaker Jim Wright's. Here's a description of Jim Jeffords written by a former member of his staff. Quote, "He consistently falls prey to the notion that he must be all things to all people, and that half-truths and outright lies are the necessary tools of survival on Capitol Hill." End quote. Now, lest anyone think that I had something to do with that article, I was stationed at the Pentagon. Now, in a recent campaign mailing, Jim Jeffords said he voted for Graham Rutland, but he supported the Democrat version of Jim Wright instead of the Republican version of Graham Rutland and Bob Stafford. Something is wrong with Jim's memory. Now, Jim Jeffords claims Vermont gets back $1 in federal spending for every 62 cents it pays in taxes. The Almanac of American Politics and U.S. Census data say that Vermont is below the national average. Something is wrong with Jim's math. When he explains his vote against the balanced budget constitutional amendment, Jim Jeffords explains it couldn't be enforced. But in his campaign mailing, he brags about supporting a balanced budget law that obviously isn't being enforced. Something is wrong with Jim's logic. Now, when Congress considered the McClure vote for changes in gun control laws, Jim Jeffords voted for the weakening amendments and then voted for the overall bill. He told both pro-gun and anti-gun people that he supported them. Now, you can vote both ways, Jim, but you can't have it both ways. Now, last Saturday, President Reagan praised alternatives to welfare, like the Job Training Partnership Act, which Jim supported. In the same broadcast, President Reagan blasted Democrat-sponsored increases in welfare, which Jim Jeffords also supported.
Mr. Griffes, excuse me, we're reaching our time limit. If you take 15 seconds to conclude.
Jim, the country and Vermont cannot afford both.
Thank you, Mike. I have 2 minutes, I believe.
You do.
First of all, I want to recognize the presence of my other primary opponent, Bill Gray, here. It's good to have you both in the same room. It's been kind of awkward trying to take you both on in separate places. It's also good to be here in Rutland. Of course, this is my hometown and the place that I grew up, and it's had a great influence on my life. Also on my standards that I live by. Of course, it's also the home of Bob Stafford, our retiring senator, the man whom I hope to replace. Bob and I had many years, good years, working together in Congress, some 14 years. As you know, he was the leading person on education in the Senate, and I was the leading Republican in the House. We worked together hard on things. In fact, we worked so well that we became known as the Vermont Connection, because we were looking out for Vermont's interests. Perhaps too much so, because that term wasn't all complimentary. There were people that said, hey, you keep getting too much for Vermont. Well, I don't apologize for that. Now, I'm here today to, again, to ask you to take a look at my record and to support me for the United States Senate. I'm looking forward to today, to a good debate. No, we have some problems, as you've already seen. You know, like 7,000 votes, a vote here, try to put them together, and you come up with a different conclusion I would come up with, obviously. But I think it's important that we do get down to the issues, and really have a sound debate on what the answers to our national problems are, and I'm looking forward to that. I've had the honor of serving Vermont and the Republican Party for over 20 years, as a state senator, as Attorney General, as our lone congressman for the past 14 years. And I'm proud of my legislative achievements in agriculture, the environment, for senior citizens, veterans, the handicapped, education, business labor issues, foreign policy and job training. I have pursued more than 350 legislative initiatives. 70% of those have passed the House, and over 50% have been passed into law. My record is my resume. Our state and the nation now face many difficult challenges. I want to continue to serve Vermont and to bring my experience and ideas to the United States Senate so that we can work to solve those problems. And I look forward to our debate today, Mike. Good to have you here. Welcome your people here to the good city of Vermont and Rutland. And a pleasure. Let's go on.
Thank you. The first question will come from our panelist, John Van Heusen, and it will be directed first to Mr. Griffes.
This question I'd like to direct to Mr. Griffes and Congressman Jeffords. It's the same question. Could you tell us, please, what is the single most compelling reason Vermonters should not vote for your opponent and why?
Thank compelling. I first looked closely at this race last October 29th. On October 29th, there was a vote in the House of Representatives for the budget reconciliation, that Jim Wright budget. It was 2 weeks after the stock market crashed, and there was a negotiation going on between the White House and the Congress, between the Republicans and the Democrats, between really Ronald Reagan and Jim Wright. Well, Jim Wright had lost, as he was saying that the answer to our problems was to increase taxes by over $12 billion. Jim Wright had lost that. He kept the vote open, turned it around, got one Texas Democrat to switch his vote to raise taxes as opposed to controlling spending, which was what President Reagan was trying to do in that. Well, Jim Wright pulled the rug out from under Reagan with that maneuver. He won 206 to 205 by one vote to raise taxes, and by the way, to give a 3% pay raise to the federal government, including Congress, which was in that budget. Now, that one vote that pulled the rug out from under President Reagan and the Republicans in their efforts to control spending, it was cast by the one Republican who voted with Jim Wright. So that's my opponent. Now, there's a difference between Republicans and Democrats. I'm a Republican out of conviction, not out of convenience. And I think when it comes to fiscal matters, taxes and spending, the Republicans have the correct answers.
Thank you, Mr. Griffes.
We are electing a senator from the state of Vermont. You ought to have someone that knows something about the state of Vermont, who has lived here, who has spent time here, who has had public service here, who has been involved with the Republican Party here. Not someone who has come here, first asked for a job with a Democratic governor, that being refused, decided to accept the challenge offered and the support offered him by the VRA to run for senator. I've had 22 years of public service for Vermont. I think you should look at that experience. I have served the Republican Party for an equal length of time. I think that is what Vermonters ought to consider. For I am a Vermont Republican. I am a Vermont Republican who will go and represent Vermonters, not a Virginia Republican who wants to go to represent Republicans.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Alan Lagarde.
The theme of this question is for each of you.
Can't quite hear. If you can pull the mic a little closer.
The theme of the question is whether each of you might be out of step with part of your constituency, specifically Representative Jeffords. While you serve as a Republican congressman under a conservative president, your voting record, as Mr. Griffes has pointed out, often follows that of a liberal Democrat. My question to you then is, are you out of step with your party? And for Mr. Griffes, in 1986, the people of Vermont re-elected a liberal Democrat to the Senate by a landslide and re-elected a Democrat as governor. While you present yourself as a relatively unbending conservative, are you out of step with many of the Vermonters that you hope to represent?
Okay, Mr. Griffes will answer first, please.
I believe I answered first this time.
Okay.
I think we alternate.
Alternate? Okay.
So we don't end up always having the tail end of the questions here. First of all, I have no problem with that. I'm a Republican. Back in 1976, when the National Republican Party was looking for someone to help the nation say, hey, Republicans are good, I was the lead-off witness in that national campaign because I represent the mainstream of the Republican Party. My 22 years with the Republican Party has demonstrated a faithful allegiance to it, and I believe in the principles of the Republican Party. Thus, I do not apologize for those times that I have differed with the President. But I also would point out that I have been invited to more bill signings by President Reagan for the work that I have done on very important bills than any other member of the House, to my knowledge. Such things as the Job Training Partnership Act, debt reduction to get our national debt under control. I could go on. But to me, being a Republican doesn't necessarily mean that you vote every time with the President. No. What it means is that you have those basic principles that the party embodies, and I believe I have those.
Thank you. Mr. Griffes?
Well, out of step, no. I'm a Republican, as I said, out of conviction, not out of convenience. And I don't think that that means that somebody should be 100% with the administration or any of their Republican or party colleagues in the House. But I think when opposition to support ratios go from 2 to 1, 60% opposition to the Republican Party and 30% support for the Republican Party, 32% this last year. You really need to take another look at the problem. I disagree with the administration on a few things. I believe that they drag their feet on acid rain. And when it comes to the heart of the matter, I come back to the fiscal, the taxes and spending things, I come down on the Republican side. I think most Vermonters do too. There is a case for Vermont common sense in Washington. And I do not believe that the people of Vermont, the people that I've been talking to, feel that Washington has done everything it can to control federal spending. I do not believe that they are spending your dollars wisely. I do not believe that the majority of Vermonters are interested in a tax increase. I've made a firm promise on that. I think we can represent a proper percentage of Vermont.
Okay, we have reached the time limit. Thank you. Our next question will come from Jill Pearson of WSYB.
Gentlemen, many municipalities around the state of Vermont, as well around the nation, are facing rising property taxes, and they're getting fewer services. Would you support reinstitution of the federal revenue sharing program?
Mr. Griffes?
Well, there's a danger with pure federal revenue sharing. The idea that you take the tax, the responsibility for organizing and administering the tax away from those people who have to spend the money. Although the revenue sharing has done some good. A continuation and expanded of revenue sharing carte blanche for the states is probably a mistake. We need to make sure that those dollars are under local control. Now that was done under federal revenue sharing where it was given. But there's a danger with the dollars always coming from Washington and always having the micromanagement that comes through a federal bureaucracy. We need to keep the taxing authority and the responsibility for administering those taxes at the lowest possible level.
I would support the reinstitution of revenue sharing when it's possible. It's not possible right now because of the deficit situation. But I do it somewhat differently. Originally, when it was passed in the Nixon administration, it was done to try and assist in the educational program to ensure adequate revenues were available at the local level. I think we got away from that in the last revenue sharing proposal that was passed. Thus, I would make it available, but only to use it as leverage to help increase the amount of money available for education.
Thank you. Back to John Van Heusen. Going on to the policy area, or the issue area of foreign policy and defense. Your question, please.
In the last debate, an issue of credibility arose over the issue of the line of death in the Gulf of Sidra. Mr. Griffes, you claim you crossed the line of death in the Naval Helicopter Patrol in 1980. Congressman Jeffords has a different version of the story and says that the line was established later. Would you please have both of your versions of this issue?
Mr. Jeffords?
Sure. Well, it's a little hard for me because I wasn't there, and I assure that Mike, at some point, probably was in the Gulf of Sidra, as I was many times back in the 60s, and thus I would expect that he probably was there. However, the real troubles with Libya did not occur until the mid to late 80s. In the Gulf of Sidra, and the line of death was not established by Gaddafi until 1986. Thus, you'll have to look to Mike for his response as to what he was doing there and under what conditions. I would only point out as a naval officer that I would hope that we were not sending our ASW helicopters to patrol the line of death against MiGs.
Thank you. Mr. Griffes?
Jim, there's a larger question in this thing. It's a matter of veracity. Because I stand by my story, and I'd explain that circumstance to you, in fact, right after the last debate, Jim. And you choose to ignore the explanation. I think it's important that a senator have a knowledge of international affairs and what's happened. 3230 North was a line that was drawn by Gaddafi in the late 70s. I think it was about 79. It said, no intrusion, this is territorial waters. In 1981, there began a series of freedom of navigation challenges by the U.S. government to that, of which I believe I was involved in the first. And it was a case of a single frigate going down and flying the coast to challenge it. We ordered to fly while the MiGs were flying and during their exercises. It was an interesting thing, rather memorable. In 1981, later in that year, 2 Libyan MiGs shot at 2 U.S. aircraft, and there were 2 MiGs shot down in 1981. Now, in 1986, Gaddafi held a news conference in a boat on what is now known as the line of death in the press. The 3230 North was important then. It is now, and I back up the U.S. administration on what it has done to ensure freedom of navigation around the world and in the Gulf of Sidra.
Thank you. Our next question dealing with foreign policy and defense will come from Alan Lagarde.
Negotiating with General Noriega, the Reagan administration is attempting to reach an agreement with a man alleged to be a high-powered drug dealer. Do you feel that is proper to negotiate with Noriega? And secondly, what role should Congress play in the entire situation?
Mr. Griffes.
Well, there's a tendency at large for senators and congressmen to grab a microphone too often and too quick. Now, I'm on the record regarding the particular situation in Panama, and that is that we should not negotiate away a criminal indictment. I think that is wrong. I'm not sure what the history books are going to show. I do believe that democracy is still in its cradle in Panama, and generally, I don't know whether it's next week, next month, or next year, I'm hoping for the same thing to happen in Panama that happened in the Philippines, with our encouragement, with our patience, without shedding blood.
I don't think I disagree with Mike on his answer. I would only point out that I believe that we took what could have been a very positive situation as far as getting rid of Noriega, and somehow by our interfering into the matters turned it into a bad one. We should have let the South Americans and the Central Americans be the ones that pushed Noriega out. When we attempted to do it ourselves, what we did was cause the people of Panama to basically turn around to a certain extent, because you began to be an America versus Panama rather than a situation which should have been oriented towards getting rid of Noriega. Having done that, however, I would agree with Mike that we should not have negotiated to try and get him out by negotiating away any kind of a criminal charge or indictment.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. The final question coming from this issue area will come from Joe Pearson. Chris, pardon me.
Given the recent Pentagon scandals and the current disarmament treaties with the Soviet Union, apparently inflated defense budgets, would you continue to support the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative?
I think that's my question.
It is,
yes.
Mr. Jeffords.
I have not been a supporter of SDI. One of the reasons, which is alluded to in the question, is its budget impact. But more basically than that, it's a system which cannot really provide us with the kind of security that it's aimed to do. The cost of it gets up somewhere around $1 trillion. And yet when you're finished, what you have done is not to provide us with any security against ballistic missiles, some security perhaps against them, but even that is precarious. In addition to that, you have no defense against your cruise missiles or your dipping low entry missiles of other sorts. Thus what you have done is spend $1 trillion to build something for which you really don't get anything. It's a good bargaining chip, and I have supported its research and development for that purpose. But it is not, by any means, going to help us to do the things that we need to do to provide security to the country. But the question also implies, quite correctly, that if you put your resources, $1 trillion or even half of that, where are you going to get the necessary funds with regard to your conventional forces, or to strengthen our economy or our social programs in other ways? You just can't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Griffes?
I support the Strategic Defense Initiative, to make it clear. I know Jim feels the way he does, and I know those are the arguments regarding SDI that are used by Governor Dukakis. Now, I would have supported the President in the research and development of SDI, and we talk about dollars. The President asked for $4.8 billion this year in research and development. He got $4 billion. Jim, you voted to cut that even further to $3.5 billion and limit the testing of the technology and put it off even further. We've been spending those dollars wisely. Now, I've seen a lot of slideshows, high-tech slideshows in my professional career, and I know there's sometimes a difference, big difference, between what's promised and what can be delivered. But this administration has negotiated, the Reagan administration has negotiated the first real reduction in weapons, and it's done it from a position of strength. Now, when I was at the Pentagon, one of the slides I had to put on the board every morning was how many minutes and seconds the nearest nuclear warhead was away from Washington. It's a very real problem. The most destabilizing weapons that are out there are intercontinental ballistic missiles. SDI, there is technical promise. We can reduce the utility and risk of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and progress in research and development of SDI can and should and hopefully will lead to a real reduction in tension and another real level of reduction in arms, because it will make ballistic missiles less useful. And right now they are our most destabilizing weapon. We need to remove the threat of nuclear terror from our children.
Thank you very much. The third set of questions will be in the areas of health, aging, and environment and agriculture, starting with Mr. Van Heusen.
Congressman Jeffords and Mr. Griffes, there are 2,500 farms in Vermont today. How many farms do you believe will be left in the state when the dairy crisis bottoms out? And what real measures do you offer to solve this problem?
That question should first be answered by Mr. Griffes.
Question on the family farm hits close to home, because I was a young teenager when I saw my grandfather lose his farm, saw the equipment go on the auction block. I believe that we need to do what we need to do, necessary programs to preserve the family farm. We need to make sure that our policy, our government policy and regulations are entirely consistent across the board, that we don't give subsidies on one hand and restrict or tax to take away those farms on the other. Because we need to make sure across the board that we're supporting what we intend to support. I think the real key, what we have here, I believe it was last week, first apples went from Vermont to the European Common Market. That's a toehold, that's a door that started to open. The real answer is freeing up trade, because the U.S. can still be the breadbasket, still be the milk producer that helps the rest of the world. I've had some experience in international trade, international marketing, and we need to hold the Western governments that committed this year to reducing trade barriers, agricultural trade barriers, and opening those agricultural markets. They made a commitment. Right now it's their words and signatures on a piece of paper. We need to hold them to it, and that is the long-term answer.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffords?
Well, that's the third time Mike has been asked that question, and I've read each answer, and I still don't understand what you're going to do for our dairy farmers. But we'll have a chance to get to that later, because I'm going to ask you the same question again under my question. What do we have to do? First of all, we are in a crisis. Anybody that has traveled around Vermont can see that. Anyone that has watched the auction sales knows that. In order to do that, we have to take a program and establish a basis for an allocation of production to the Northeast, not just Vermont. We can't just handle Vermont. There are several options out there, and I'll mention some. First of all, there's the Leahy regionalization plan. Probably not politically feasible, but it would do the job. The National Commission recommends that we go to what's called a two-tier pricing system, as well as a targeted holder buyout. I have supported both of those. In 1981, we passed it. That also will do the job. In addition to that, we can attempt, at least politically, to isolate or to set off in a different milk order the West Coast. Their cost of production is lower because of all the subsidization they get from the federal government for water. That also would be very helpful. My expectations are, however, that we will be able to save most of Vermont's farm if we can also protect the milk order system as it is and the Capper-Volstead Act.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jeffords. Our next question will come from Alan Lagarde.
Gentlemen, in Robert Stafford, you're seeking to replace one of the strongest supporters of the environment in the U.S. Senate. What proposals do you have or support to solve the acid rain problem? And as a senator, what specifically would you do to help the acid rain problem in Vermont?
Mr. Jeffords?
Yes, I have pleasure to answer that question. I worked very closely with Bob Stafford. As he worked in the Senate, I worked in the House. I served as the chairman of the Environmental Study Commission in the House, and worked very hard with the New England people to bring forward the programs to stop the acid rain problem. We have an initiative which would spread the cost, but at the same time require a 10 million ton reduction over a period of 4 years to try and get sulfur dioxide emissions under control. We also have to step up our NOx emission standards with respect to automobiles. Senator Stafford came close to getting that through the Senate. It's presently out of committee. We are still trying to get it in position where we can put an amendment on as a change must come out for the air quality standards with respect to ozone. So I'm hopeful that even this year we may do something, but we need to do something and we need to do it quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Griffes?
Acid rain is the biggest environmental problem. You are correct. The problem is not technical because the technology is there to solve the problem. Economically, as you cited there, Jim, it's a matter of trying to spread the cost, to share it amongst those people who are currently benefiting from that pollution. The third thing is the political problem to solve it. And right now, the Democratic Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, Senator Byrd from West Virginia, coal-producing West Virginia. And the biggest problem also that you cited is the political problem, trying to get that thing out, trying to get it for action. Basically, we need to put a deadline and a very aggressive time schedule on reducing the emissions, the end product. This is whether it's sulfur or nitrogen or ozone that's going into the atmosphere. Put a deadline on it and hold industry and community utilities toes to the fire to solve that deadline. I've seen a lot of crocodile tears from industry and government people who look at solving problems. It's not technical, it's economic. Because we need to be able to share those costs to fix it. I think we can if we take and make it an economically viable solution, we can get those costs spread and shared so that everybody flips a light switch. Everybody who buys a car that's produced in the Midwest is going to pay a share of fixing the problem. The problem right now is political, not technical, really not that economic.
Thank you very much. The last question will come from Chris Pearson.
In the face of rising health care and insurance costs, are you in favor of socializing health care or of a national health care program?
Mr. Griffes?
No. I think the bill that was passed and signed into law by President Reagan, which was the catastrophic health insurance, which was also self-financing, I believe it was signed about 2.5 months ago, I would have endorsed and voted for. It's the right approach to helping those in need, which we must do. But the dangers of what your question there, as far as socialized medicine, we have continued to throw more money at health care, as we should, to help the needy. Has it improved access? Marginally. Does it improve quality? Marginally. So we need to make sure that we're getting bang for the buck for what we're doing in health care, as much as we need to make sure we're getting bang for the buck that's going through the Defense Department. We need to be able to help our older citizens. The problem here in Vermont is making sure, and this is the case, that we've got 16 hospitals, I believe, here in Vermont, and we need to make sure that we've got access to those rural hospitals. We need to make sure that those Medicaid payments are going through those hospitals consistently, and we need to make sure that those hospitals that carry an especially heavy burden in helping the indigent, as a proportion of the care that they have to provide, that they get proper assistance, because the last thing we need is to lose more hospitals in Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffords?
Thank you. There's not, again, much that I disagree with Mike on this particular issue, but let's take a look at some of the specific problems and how we must deal with them. Catastrophic health care has been dealt with. The next one that must be dealt with is long-term health care. What do we mean by that? We have serious problems with the families being able to suffer along with people who have a situation where it goes on and on and on. We can't do it the way that has been suggested by Mr. Pepper, but there are ways that we can do it. First of all, we have to find a financing system that will not push the burdens off onto the people of the future. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we can, and all of us who are in my age group and younger should realize that perhaps part of our pension-type programs should be taking care of long-term health care. Also, we have to look at a system which will bring money in from the same generation that is receiving the benefits. I would agree with Senator Mitchell and others that have proposed perhaps we look at some increases in the estate taxes on large estates. There are a number of things that we can do. Secondly, another basic problem we have is that fewer and fewer businesses are covering health care because of the increased costs. We need to find an answer to that, but not by mandating. We need to make it available. We need to have risk pools in the states, which we should help at the federal level to give incentives to, and also to make sure that all of us can get covered. But in final analysis, I do not agree with what you referred to as socialized medicine.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. We'll now move on to the fourth item in the program, which is questions from candidates to each other. They will have an opportunity to ask 2 one-minute questions each, and we will follow our same pattern of rotation. So I believe, according to my count, the first question would come from Mr. Jeffords to Mr. Griffes.
Let's go back to agriculture again, Mike. As I said, you've been asked that question 3 times, and you say it very nicely, but you don't say what you're going to do. And I would hope, now let me just go down through some of the specific programs that I mentioned, and maybe I just got a yes or no out of you. Maybe that's the easiest way to do it. Would you support the Leahy regionalization plan?
Continue your question.
Okay, I'll go through them all. Would you support the National Commission's recommendation of a 2-tier system with respect to pricing as well as a targeted whole herd buyout? You can divide that in 2. Would you vote to attempt to shift the burden to the West Coast of a higher for a less of a cost, it has less of a cost of production, and therefore shift more of the burden to them? Would you vote to repeal the Capital Volstead Act? Would you vote, as some would suggest, that we do away with milk orders?
Answer the question in general, and we'll go back through the history. What we need to do is preserve the family farm. I said that. But in general, we've got a political problem in Washington. You mentioned the diversion program from 2 years ago. The Vermont Farm Bureau, I guess, was against that. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't mention the diversion program. I'm talking other alternatives. You want?
Well, you've got a long list of proposals in agriculture.
Right.
Vermont will never beat California or the West for influence in agriculture. As long as the competition for agricultural policy, micromanagement, is between Western agricultural interests, who can really support a good many $100,000 a year lobbyists in Washington, says Vermont's going to have a problem. What we need to do is return a little bit of freedom, continue the supports, but preserve the freedom for farmers to control their own fate, not their own quotas, and that includes regional pricing, matter of getting pricing back to something where the farmers can react to market. And I support the regional pricing. But in general, whatever we're doing over the next decade, or 2 or 3, beyond the specific questions here, we need to give the power to the farmers to control their own fate. And we need to be extremely careful about competing with the West for influence in agriculture. Because I know that in the case of that diversion program, it was a net loss of over $3 million right out of Vermont farmers' pockets to go to Western agricultural interests. I listened to the Vermont farmers, I listened to the Vermont Farm Bureau in making those decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Griffes. Your question to Mr. Jeffords, please.
Over the last 2 years, Jim, you've accepted over $30,000 in honoraria from special interests, of which you pocketed, I believe, over $15,000 for personal use. This, in addition to the nearly $500,000 you've accepted from political action committees, money you can legally put in your pocket when you leave Congress. In describing these congressional practices, former U.S. Attorney in Boston, William Weld, called them, and I quote, completely illegal. A lay-down criminal case if committed by someone in the executive branch, end quote. Now, my question has 2 parts. Don't the voters expect you to work full-time for $90,000 a year? And could you please explain the difference between accepting these sorts of contributions and honoraria and a bribe? I do not believe you can have it both ways.
Oh, great. That's a little quick tonight, isn't it? Well, let's take a look, first of all, at the honoraria. I have the best record, top 6% of the way I handle my honoraria in the Congress. Now, that may not speak too well to the others, but it is something that you should know. I only accept $500. Now, when you take the taxes out, that's about $200. And I do that because otherwise I wouldn't make a speech across the nation. And that's hard to say, and you can argue that that's not good. I don't believe we should have honoraria. I would like to do away with it. But it is the system that is there, and I have given over $40,000, I believe, to charity by virtue of that system, and I'm proud of that, and I've given it all to Vermont charities. Now, you talk about special interest money. Mike, you are a PAC peddler. That's what you were in Washington. You're the one that gave the checks out. You gave me a check. And then all of a sudden, perhaps because you haven't been too successful in getting your own, you're suddenly very down on the system, as is Bill Gray. He's the premier PAC pursuer in the United States, I think, at least as far as per capita goes. and yet both of you have attacked me because I've been successful at getting money which you haven't been able to get. What's wrong with that? Okay? The system may be bad, but don't ask me at the last minute to change something just because you haven't been able to be successful except from a Midwestern coal-burning utility to get any PAC money. So what do you want me to do? Let's change the system, okay? Whoever's elected, let's guarantee to the people out here that we won't have the kind of honorarium system that we have. And we won't have the kind of raising money on PACs. I'm with you on that.
Thank you very much. Your, Mr. Jeffords, your question, second question to Mr. Griffes.
Yeah, you have criticized me, Mike, for voting against some of the President's initial programs dealing with the so-called Reaganomics. There were three parts to that. The first part had to do with reducing taxes. The second part had to do with increasing defense spending. And the third part had to do with shifting the burden back to the states by shifting to them the cost of programs. Now, surprisingly, this past week, and just earlier in your statement today, you criticized me for not bringing enough money back to Vermont. Now, if you would support the so-called new federalism, which would have decimated the amount of money coming to Vermont, how can you then turn around and say that you would go down there and get more money, more pork for Vermont? And especially, you should keep in mind, down in Congress, if you don't vote for everybody else's pork, you aren't going to get any yourself. And yet that was a key part of how you're going to balance the budget. So tell me, how do you reconcile those statements?
I've made a promise in this campaign, and that's to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I will not vote, understand this, not vote for any measure which is not in the national interest to benefit a particular state, congressional district, or industry, period, including Vermont. It says, I will not be part of the problem, I will be part of the solution. Now, what we've got with the Reaganomics, and I like to point this out, says we've had 8 years, the tax cuts. Really, there was only 1 year when real revenues dipped for the federal government, 1983. And every other year, real revenues, through increases in energy taxes, Social Security taxes, corporate taxes, and some adjustments to individual taxes, revenues have increased to the federal government every year but one, 1983. Real spending has increased faster. That's why we've got a growing deficit. Now, I'm worried about the deficit, but I'm more worried about what it represents, and that's unconstrained growth in federal spending. Now, Vermont is not getting as much money back for the taxes that we put in, and believe it or not, there's a legitimate contracts, legitimate business of the federal government in procurement, as well as private industry, and I plan on being a partner with that Commissioner of Economic Development for the state of Vermont and trying to bring legitimate federal and private jobs to Vermont. Now, that doesn't mean get along and go along down in Congress and putting pork back into the budget. Pork is the problem, and we need to cut it.
Thank you, Mr. Griffes. Your final question directed to Mr. Jeffords, please.
Jim, why do you continue to defend your efforts on behalf of the mob-infested Teamsters? You say your ideology is to represent Vermont.
Oh, come on, Mike. Yeah. Go ahead.
Were your special efforts on behalf of the Teamsters, after accepting their $5,000 check, really representing Vermont or representing a Washington special interest in trouble with the law?
Okay, Mike, here we go again. First of all, you're a master at not answering questions, and I listened to that previous one where you never once mentioned you were going to go down there and reverse things and get pork for Vermont. Go right on. You're very good at just kind of sliding by those things. We've gone over this Teamsters issue over and over again. You know that. Either you haven't read the letter or you deliberately misstate the facts. I didn't get a contribution or a check and then write the letter. That's an absolute falsehood, and you know it is, and you've repeated and you've written it. So you ought to at least admit to that. Secondly, that letter did not ask the Justice Department not to bring suit against the Teamsters. You know that. You must have read the letter. You also must have seen that that letter was signed by the minority leader, by a similar letter sent by Jack Kemp and other conservatives who I know you just idolize. And then you just turn around, and twist those facts and state them in just the perfect way of what's wrong with politics by saying guilt by association. That was done with good purposes to try and make sure that the mob went to jail, but that our Vermont Teamsters our UPS workers, our St. Johnsbury truckers did not lose their right to have control over their own contract. And you know that, Mike. So let's put an end to that one, huh? Let's be honest for once, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. Okay, moving on to the last item on our agenda. We will hear closing remarks from each candidate, which will be no longer than 3.5 minutes each. According to the flip of the coin, Mr. Jeffords will be the first to offer his closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. 22 years ago, I asked the people of the county of Rutland to send me to the Vermont State Senate, and they did. And it was an exhilarating time. All the issues that we faced, change was there. We had welfare reform and tax reform. We had the anti-billboard law, which Vermont is now famous for. I was proud to take part in those. 20 years ago, Vermonters supported me, and I was elected to be Attorney General of Vermont. And I'm pleased with the record that I accomplished there. It was also an exciting time working with the Davis administration, bringing Vermont's development under control, working to bring the state of New York and the International Paper Company to the United States Supreme Court to make them stop polluting Lake Champlain, licensing Vermont Yankee, a number of things that we accomplished during those glorious years, and I'm proud of that record. 14 years ago, the people of the state of Vermont elected me to be their lone congressman. And I'm proud of the achievements that I made there. What we have done is to take a look at some of the problems of this nation. We have been trying to protect the benefits for our senior citizens through innovative programs like the cash-out food stamp program, a record that has safeguarded our state and national economic interests through support for deficit reduction legislation, for small state minimum guarantees to ensure Vermont's fair share of federal dollars, for fair trade accords, such as the new U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Agreement. But achievements, no matter how many, are only as good as those who make them possible. And none of my achievements would have been possible without the strong and steady support of you Vermonters. Like laurels, achievements also are not something you rest on. There are too many challenges that remain and lie ahead. And the accomplishment that I would like to be most remembered for is for solving those. First and foremost, there will be the overwhelming need to get our deficit under control. This is no easy solution. There's not a simple tax or cut issue. This is an issue of choices, and making sure that in our quest to reduce the federal deficit, our commitments and responsibilities to our people and our security are not jeopardized.
Mr. Jeffords, if you would take a few seconds to conclude your remarks, please.
Oh my gosh, let's get going here. All right, sure.
It was 3.5, correct?
3.5.
Okay, well, Vermont's dairy industry, as I have tried to point out, is at a crisis point. And I have the experience to help that situation. George Bush desires to be the education president, and I have the experience in the educational issue to help him realize that dream. Bob Stafford tried to do the best he could to realize his dream of bringing acid rain under control. I have the experience to make that dream a reality. Gorbachev gives us new challenges that we have not seen in how to handle the problems with the third world and to be a leader and to prevent the spread of communism. Well, I am here now today to ask for your support again to help meet those challenges. And I offer you my experience and my dedication to the state and the nation to carry out those promises. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Griffes.
There's a fog in politics. You've heard a lot of severe rhetoric here, I guess, this morning. And I hope that each of you look at it very closely and look at the record and look at what I have said very carefully. It's a personal decision to get involved in running for the United States Senate, and I do it out of real conviction on the issues. My grandfather, Will Gardner, moved to Vermont in 1888 from Nova Scotia to Island Pond. He died there 94 years later, with some people still calling him a flatlander. Some people still say that about me, but I know that as long as I remembered what I learned in the Northeast Kingdom, I'd be a part of Vermont, because I do know where home is. Now, those who taught me those things are here this morning. This is my parents, my grandmother, my aunt and uncle, and a sister. And my promise to that family and the promise to the people of Vermont is to remember what you've taught me. I left for Pensacola Naval Air Station the same month that my father was sworn into the Vermont State Legislature. I could have stayed and worked in the family business, but I didn't want to wear my country's uniform. And that military experience has been a big part of my life. As we discussed it here this morning, I had some interesting nights and some interesting times in the Mediterranean and in other places. Now, some people may not think that that's a qualification for being a U.S. Senator. I believe that it is. If I had gone down on one of those dark nights to a Libyan missile, or an accident at sea, or a mechanical failure, the U.S. Navy would have answered questions about me by saying I was Lieutenant Mike Griffes from East Charleston, Vermont. Now, my children aren't here this morning. Jimmy's in kindergarten. My youngest two are staying with relatives in Johnson. But it's really for the children, those children, your children, really all the children of the world, that you will be voting for U.S. Senate. Because the wisdom of the men and women that you send to the U.S. Senate will determine what the future of those children will be. Will these children have the opportunities that our generation has had? Will they have the skills that they need to compete in what is truly a world economy? Will America still be a shining light of freedom? Will we be living that promise that Lincoln found in the Declaration of Independence? That promise that someday the weight will be lifted off the shoulders of all men and that all will have a chance. And when these children grow up, will they still have fresh air to breathe, clean water to drink, and will Vermont still be so green? And we're on the verge of a new century. The question is, will it be what George Bush suggested, another American century? Can we keep America moving forward, always forward, for that 1,000 points of light, for an endless, eternal dream? Well, I believe that we can do it. I know that we can. President Reagan said, of course, we dream great dreams. We're Americans. I urge you a week from this morning, when you go in there and pull the curtain, slice through the rhetoric, look at the issues, and decide how you want to be represented in Washington, in the United States Senate. Your children will likely have a chance to vote for who is elected. Thank you.
Thank you. In closing, I would like to take 1 minute to thank John Van Heusen from the Rutland Herald, Alan Lagarde from WNNE-TV, and Chris Pearson from WSYB for participating as panelists this morning. I certainly would like to thank the candidates for their willingness to share their ideas in public with those of us from the Rutland area, and certainly all of you for participating in this event today. Thank you, and exercise your rights as Americans and vote in this election season. Thank you.